What is a map? It seems like a really simple question to answer. You probably already have a definition in mind. Maybe you're thinking, well, a map is a piece of paper that accurately shows the geography of a region. Perhaps you think a map is a tool that tells you how to get from one place to another place. Whatever the case, you're probably wondering why I even asked the question. Cartographic scholars generally have the same thought, even, in the case of one research group, going so far as to respond, "The answer seems so simple and so obvious that it is silly even to ask." But is it really that obvious? To say that would imply that if I showed a picture to a bunch of map scholars, or even just a bunch of college students, they could all tell me if a picture is or is not a map, and they would all give the same answer. But take this engraved mammoth tusk from the village of Pavlov in the modern Czech Republic. Does this look like a map to you? Maybe not, but according to archaeologists, the curved markings are supposed to represent the Thaya River and surrounding clay hills. The tusk may have been used as a directional map for hunters in 25,000 BCE. How about this diagram? Famous psychologist Carl Jung calls this the map of the soul. It has map in the name, but if you ask Carl Jung for directions, he probably won't say, "Ah, yes, turn west at your ego, walk the length of 2 anima, and you'll reach your destination." With all of the maps that pose strange exceptions to the mean, maybe it's harder to answer the question, what is a map, than it is to answer the opposite question, what isn't a map? Before we continue, it's important to tackle the question, why do we need to define the word map? And that's not easily answered. There are plenty of things that don't necessarily come to mind when you hear the word map, but you still wouldn't easily be able to explain what prevents them from being maps. And that makes cartography complicated. Picture you're a museum curator, trying to develop a new exhibit that represents the artists of New York City. If you have a very narrow definition of art, maybe you'll focus on famous painters who lived in the city, Rothko, Basquiat, Pollock, or the sculptors and architects of New York's many statues and skyscrapers. Sure, all of these are universally recognized as art, but can you really claim to be representing the whole of New York's artistry without showcasing street art and graffiti? In limiting your definition of art, you run the risk not only of ignoring the historical and cultural relevance of modern artistic styles, but also of enforcing an entrenched canon of art, which likely excludes artists identifying as indigenous, black, brown, disabled, queer, or a member of any group that doesn't match with the canonized notion of art. For a cartographer or historian, a more exclusive definition of the word map leads to a more exclusive understanding of history. In order to attain the most inclusive definition of this word, we have to look at what it has meant throughout history. So let's go back to the beginning. The word map is a shortened form of the Middle English mappamundi and the French mappamonde. Both of those words are derived from the Latin words mappa mundi. Mundi, and subsequently the English monde and French monde, translates to mean of the world, from the Latin mundus, which means world or universe. The words mappa, mep, and map are Punic in origin, meaning tablecloth, napkin, or flag, coming from the Mishnaic term menafa, for a fluttering banner or cloth. The term mappamundi was used in the late 1300s, during which world maps were painted on vellum and cloth scrolls. Before the Age of Exploration, world maps, which generally just consisted of Europe, Africa, and Asia, were not used primarily to identify geography or travel routes. Instead, maps like the Hereford and Ebsdorf mappamundi documented history, with a cultural focus on the people, flora, and fauna of distant lands. It makes sense then that they should be called mappamundi, essentially the world on a cloth. Especially for the royals and aristocrats who commissioned these expensive maps, who would likely never travel beyond their territory, owning a representation of the world on a cloth was pretty close to owning the world itself. The shortened form of mappamundi, map, was first used in 1527, defined as a drawing upon a plane surface representing a part or whole of the Earth's surface or the heavens, with the various points drawn in proportion and in corresponding positions. The concept of proportional maps, with accurate distance measurement, was born with this definition, or at least reborn. The Greeks had been there, done that. This was likely in correspondence with the cartographic endeavors of Gerardus Mercator, the namesake of a style of world maps projected as unrolled cylinders. In 1543, Andreas Vesalius developed the first anatomical atlas, mapping, proportionally, the skeleton, nervous system, and organs of the human body. With an ironic similarity to the Latin translation of Mappamundi, Vesalius' book was called De Humani Corporis Fabrica, or The Fabric of the Human Body. At this point in history, the Americas had been discovered, and maps became more functional than in previous years, being used for navigation at sea, measuring distance, and dividing territories. In 1586, the verb form of map was first used, meaning to make a map of, just like Mercator mapped the world. Keep in mind that this use of the word specifically refers to the literal drawing of a map, as opposed to the figurative sense. If Mercator had just traveled the world and written down his discoveries and measurements, he wouldn't be mapping anything until he physically drew the squiggly continental coast on a scroll. The figurative version of the verb appeared in 1610, in the sense of mapping something out. A sailor could now map out his voyage, and an astronomer could look through a telescope and mentally map a constellation. Along with the verb form, the 1600s also led to an update of the noun map, which added the figurative definition, epitome, or detailed representation of anything. So now we're going into abstract territory. Maps in the 1600s didn't need to be on cloth or depict the world. The terrestrial globe, invented by Nuremberg in 1492, could be referred to as a map, not just a sphere with a map wrapped around it. In Shakespeare's 68th sonnet, published in 1609, he writes, "Thus in his cheek the map of days outworn." In this case, he's saying that a true artist's face shows depth and natural aging instead of the unnatural shallow beauty of later artistic styles. By the 17th century, Anglophones used the word map when specifically referring to images showing the entire world or large regions. Representations of seas and other bodies of water were called charts, and any geographical drawing prepared from direct observation and precise measurement was a plan. It wasn't until the late 1800s that the word map became an umbrella term for all of these diagrams. In 1853, the word cartography was first used to mean the making of charts or maps. Graphy comes from the Greek graphene, meaning to write or draw, and carto comes from the medieval Latin word carta, which generally meant a leaf of paper, a charter, or a playing card. In the 1570s, though, the definition of carte expanded to a map for the use of navigators, and the spelling changed, giving us the modern word chart. This term for what we now call maps was used by non-English speakers far before Anglophones developed a word for it. Europeans had been creating carta since medieval times as navigational aids. 1516 saw the first carta marina, or nautical sheet, copied via printing press, and subsequently the adjective marina was dropped, leaving the word carta to refer to any geographical representation. The Dutch had been using a similar word, kaart, in the 1520s, and the 1532 dictionary, Woordenboek der Nederlandsche Taal, was the first to officially define the term as a sheet representing the surface of the earth or part thereof. Now that we have some basis for the etymology of the word, we can look into the modern definitions. If you were a Merriam-Webster dictionary, you'd define map, noun, as a representation, usually on a flat surface, of the whole or part of an area. Sounds pretty straightforward, but then the second definition expands that to include a representation of the celestial sphere, or part of it. The third definition adds any diagram or other visual representation that shows the relative position of the parts of something. Then, the dictionary throws in yet another definition. A map is something that represents with clarity suggestive of a map. Okay, so to Merriam-Webster, a map is any representation of an area on Earth, a representation of an area not on Earth, or a representation of a thing made of smaller things, as well as anything that isn't a representation of any of those things, but kind of seems like one. A map is anything that is, or almost is, a map. If you trust Wikipedia, and we all trust Wikipedia, a map is a symbolic depiction emphasizing relationships between elements of some space, such as objects, regions, or themes. As we've seen, throughout history, the definition of a map has become broader and broader, and the linguistic attempt to identify a single work that epitomizes the word map has been successful only at angering cartographers. If we think of a map as being only a map insofar as it shows similarities to some prototype ideal map, then we have to deal with the consequence that everything is in some part mappish, but only the prototype itself can be 100% a map. If instead we collect all of the definitions throughout history and assume that to be a map, something has to fit into at least one of those definitions, it would be just as difficult to name something that isn't a map. And on the opposite end, if a map has to be something that fits every single definition for a map, finding a map would be as likely as finding a live dodo bird, and cartographers would have the same credibility as astrologers. The linguist George Lakoff developed an experiment in 1978 based on the hypothesis that a prototype map, representing the epitome of the term, doesn't have to be a singular map by which all others are classified. Instead, he believes that for something to be classified as a map, It must align with certain prototype properties that we have culturally decided make up all maps. Lakoff asked large numbers of college students and graduates to identify images as maps or not maps, and based on the result, he found 4 qualities that were the most universally present in the images his subject identified as maps. By Lakoff's definition, a map must include the scaled correspondence of an image to the world, a graphic form, a degree of semiotic abstraction, and spatial functionality. Perhaps this is the definition by which most of us identify maps, but it raises another question. Should the term map be defined by a majority of observers? Can something be a map even if no one thinks of it as a map? Or is the word itself defined only by what we perceive? Alternatively, is it up to a cartographer to decide whether or not they have drawn a map? Or can they be overruled if observers don't classify their drawing as a map? And can something be unintentionally a map? In Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Albus Dumbledore jokes that he has a scar on his leg that is a perfect map of the London Underground. Can that scar really be a map if its navigational qualities are completely coincidental? When cartographers avoid defining the word map because the answer is so obvious, they aren't necessarily referring to the fact that we all have a basic understanding of how the dictionary defines a map. In truth, we all have different maps, some of which are maps only by virtue of having been mapped, or just because we use them for a map's purposes. Carl Jung's map of the soul may not look like a map, but for those who have been able to use the concept of cognitive mapping to navigate their own soul, the overlapping circles of Jung's diagram provides them information about a location without needing to physically be there, that location being the soul. One outspoken cognitive cartographer and fan of Jung's theory is Kim Namjoon of the Korean pop group BTS. Namjoon, stage-named RM, has written lyrics in BTS's album Map of the Soul Persona that have made the psychological theory accessible to a wide audience. In a sense, has RM not also drawn a map by providing an artistic representation of Jung's map of the soul so that his audience can navigate it? The me that I want myself to be, the me that people want me to be, the me that you love, and the me that I create, the me that's smiling, the me that's sometimes in tears, vividly breathing each second and every moment even now, persona. Couldn't these definitions of self be synonymous with the regional borders drawn on world maps? There is an inherent cartographic nature in listening to RM's self-exploration. His audience has, of course, not traveled through his soul, but he has recorded his own observations and explorations to provide that information to his audience. So maybe it's a bit of a letdown that I haven't answered my own question, and have probably left you with more questions than you had this morning. The definition of a map is something that you have to decide for yourself, and perhaps no one will share your opinion that something is or isn't a map, but I hope that you come away from this with a sense of appreciation for all of the maps that guide your life, physically, emotionally, socially, and in any number of other ways. In our lives, we are constantly moving and changing our paths, but unless we are navigating that path completely at random, we're making decisions with the guidance of experiential maps. So now, as you continue on your day, I hope I've been able to provide some insight with this presentation, which is also a map.